Respected Swamiji, Pravratika ji, Professor Ishwaran, a long-standing friend, distinguished members of the mission and devotees, and my very, very dear young friends. It's a great privilege, really, for me to be in your midst today as we remember and celebrate a great and inspirational woman who decisively impacted the course of what is called the Indian Renaissance and its great thinkers of the time, from the latter part of the 19th century to the opening decades of the 20th century. Her preceptor, Swami Vivekananda, referred to her as a real lioness. Rabindranath Tagore called her Lok Mata. Sri Aurobindo described her as Agni Shikha. Subramanya Bharati, he wrote a poem on Sister Nivedita and described her thus: sun dispelling many souls' darkness, helper of the helpless. J.C. Bose, the very, very eminent scientist, she supported him and encouraged him in myriad ways. And he got the image of a woman stepping forward with a lamp in hand installed at his center in Sister Nivedita's memory. She inspired Abhinandranath Tagore to revive the unique stamp of Indian art and free it from being overwhelmed by Hellenic culture and influences. Her work among the poor and the destitute in Kolkata preceded Mother Teresa's acclaimed engagement. She cared and tended to the sick and suffering. Her fearless work during the cholera epidemic and the plague in Kolkata and the Bengal floods is well known, and it's nothing short of legendary. But what was the perennial motive in this tapestry of what I would call sacrifice and service? And what was the passion? It was really the education of women. Her tireless engagement with young girls to come to her school, to go from door to door, to persuade parents who were then not open to the idea of women getting a formal education. She would go and persuade people that education for women was in the interest of all. And she also contributed a great deal to the emancipation and revival of the country's lost traditions and genuine and abiding glory. She strove to enable women to rediscover and also to recognize their innate power and potential. Not just women, but also men. Above all, I would like to believe that, like Gandhiji much later, she was to elevate the true power of the feminine principle and foreground it in public discourse, in a manner in which it was never done before. The journey from the Irish woman Margaret Elizabeth Noble to Sister Nivedita is a fascinating story of spiritual awakening, of intellectual growth, and civic engagement. It is often said that Swami Vivekananda inspired her in this evolution. That is indeed true. But what is also true is that Swamiji recognized in her what he called a world mover, a true global citizen, but someone who could base this identity on the intrinsic strengths of India's civilizational heritage and the best traditions of its philosophy, action, its ways of being, its ways of seeing. I will not dwell too much on Sister Nivedita's own life because everyone here knows much more than I do, and I don't need to speak to the already converted. But being in the field of education, my own takeaway from her engagement and writings, especially on educating Indian women, gave me the motifs that I believe remain valid for us even today. First, I think she desired that women recognize they could turn their love into a thunderbolt, a vajra. You know, you all heard of Vajrapani, but a vajra to transform the darkness within. Now, India at that time, society itself was engulfed by despair, in some senses, a kind of looming darkness. Hers was the voice that really came as a thunderbolt, and coming from a woman who was from another so-called part of the world, but to endear herself, to immerse herself in this experience. And this is perhaps a clarion call for all of us, because we perhaps are lacking in the fact that we have not immersed ourselves in the totality and the vibrancy of what the total Indian experience can be and can deliver to each of us, both within and without. She believed that women should be encouraged to move beyond helplessness or imitation, to be the best versions of themselves rather than second-rate versions of someone else. And you know, when a country is colonized, the first thing that the elite begin to do is to imitate the colonizers in terms of their mind, in terms of their style, in terms of their fashion. Sister Nivedita said the following, and I want to quote this for you: "We must give Indian girls their own color. We do not want pale imitations of American or English women. We want, on the contrary, a womanhood that can contribute something to the circle, which otherwise it would have lacked. A certain luminosity, a certain something that perhaps was not available in the rest of the world, even in England, where the sun never set on its empire." And she often spoke about enhancing their effectiveness and their employability and creating such beautiful goods that could be marketed all over the world, which the rest of the world would find unique, intrinsically, what you would say, filled with the craft of non-violent creativity. She also anticipated the ideas of Swadeshi, I believe, and she articulated them much before Gandhiji had even formulated it. And she also, in her writing, in her work, in her very being, I think the seeds of Tilak's notion of Swarajya are to be found. The whole thing about Swarajya is not just about political independence. It's also about conquering your own baser instincts and rising to a level of true effulgence. So she wished for them, especially women of India, to have a sense of pride in their Indian identity, the best aspects of it, and a deep understanding of the study of the Indian epics, of history, of folklore, of geography, and the rich repertoire of its own languages. And to be determined at the same time to shed medieval custom and beliefs and regressive practices. Now, I talked about language here. I want to share something with you. She didn't just talk about the linguistic aspects of a particular language, not just about Bengali, not Malayalam, not Hindi, or anything. She also meant the metaphor of the language. And when you talk about the metaphor of the mother tongue, we don't just mean the language that is spoken in the family. We're talking about a metaphoric mother tongue, which is the language of women, the language of inclusion, the language that can change maps, the language that can speak truth to power, the language of inclusiveness, the language of nonviolence. These were the kind, not the sonorous father tongue, which is one of directiveness. Do this, don't do this. But a language that breaks people out of the shadows of silence and invisibility. So I'm making an appeal to all of you today that drawing from her wise, her sagacity and her experience, can we also begin, and this is equally for men, all the gentlemen here as well as the women here, let us begin to speak in the metaphoric mother tongue as this kind of language which can change maps, which can change the discourse of aggression, of competitiveness, and be the gentle language, the music of the soul. And she also wanted them to be inculcated with what she called the sense of discrimination, the ability to separate the grain from the chaff, the milk from the water, Nira Kshira Vibheda, as it's called. And here, I think somewhere deep in her consciousness, she invoked not just Saraswati, but the vehicle of Saraswati, which was the cosmic swan, Paramahansa. And of course, you know her closeness to the mother. You're all aware of this. Now, what is so significant about this cosmic swan? That it is at home in three worlds: on the earth, in the water, and in the sky. And the other aspect is, if you keep saying Hamsa, 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 keep on repeating it, you come suddenly to Soham, 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 which is this is I. To understand, to return. So all our journey, as Eliot said, we shall not stop from exploration. And the end of our exploring will be to come back to where we began and to see it for the first time. End quote. Which means we come back, in some senses, to ourselves. Of course, to the outer spaces, but also the inner recesses. And we begin to see it through a different prism. And what is that prism? That is true education. To be able to link the inner and the outer worlds. To not see a separation between the two. Now, she also emphasized a great deal, and I think somewhere, even though we are in education, I do want to acknowledge that our generation has let you down. You are much more clued to what's happening in the world than we are. And we are in no position really to give you that kind of advice, because you're going to live in a future that we cannot even imagine. When I was in college, I could not imagine that there would be something like the cell phone or the World Wide Web. So my entire teaching technology was geared to yesterday's language. But tomorrow's world awaits a new language. And you will be the script writers of that language. How you choose to write it will really depend upon how you have come back to where you began and begun to see yourself for the first time. So she also talked about synergy, serendipity, synchronicity, the three S's that you have to be open to. And she also did say that somewhere we mustn't be so proud of our intellectual achievement that we lose our humility and the human touch. And her multiple intelligences, now of course today at Harvard and many other places, people are talking about the multiple intelligences. Howard Gardner, for example, has been. And they are what? They are verbal linguistic skills, they are logical mathematical skills, they are visual and spatial skills, they are bodily and kinesthetic skills, they are musical skills, they are interpersonal, naturalist skills. So each one of us is endowed with a special kind of skill that is foregrounded over other skills. So merely because you can't do mathematics doesn't mean you're not smart. You may be beautiful in music. Or you may have kinesthetic skills, you may not have logical, rational skills, but they may not be foregrounded. So, in a sense, what she saw as an integral education was the harmonizing of all these skills. And she really believed that women, because they had been socialized in a particular way, were better receptacles to integrate these skills. And through them, there would be a transmission of a different kind of education. And she also, in a sense, anticipated the five minds of the future that is talked about today. That is the disciplined mind, the synthesizing mind, the creative mind, the respectful mind, but above all, the ethical mind. So when I said that she emphasized humility, I wanted to say that she felt that basically the education of women then is a matter of developing the heart and making the intellect efficient as a servant and not the Lord. So you can be the best mathematician in the world, you can have topped your IIM exam, but if that quality of empathy, of connectedness to the rest of the world is not there, then you're missing out, we are all missing out on an aspect of living that is so crucial. And she also talked about, she didn't talk about it openly, but she suggested it in many of her writings, that the recognition that each of us is interconnected is crucial to an understanding of a connect with the larger universe. So when we say Vasudeva Kutumbakam, it's not just about the whole world as a family. That's become a cliche. But that everyone, depends on everybody else in some way that may not be manifest to us at a particular time. For example, what has brought you to sit next to your friends on either side? What are the series of circumstances that have brought you here? From our limited perspective, we don't know. But in hindsight, sometimes we may say, oh, we happened to be at that time in that particular place so that I could hear Swamiji and my mind opened. It's exactly what happened to Margaret Noble. She happened to go to a particular evening get-together in England where Swamiji happened to be there, and that meeting changed the course of her life. So we have to be always open. I want to tell you a story here. You put on that switch there, you know that there are many connectors, which is why the light comes on. You don't see them, but they are wired in a particular way. You don't always see them because they're behind. Life in some ways is like that. It's reminded me of the story of the woman, a young girl, a young person like you, who was sitting in an airport lounge in Amsterdam and crying her heart out because she had lost her ticket. And an elderly couple came to her and said, what is the problem, dear? She said, I have lost my ticket. I have no money to buy another one. I don't know what's going to happen to me. And she kept crying and crying and crying. So then the elderly couple said, look, don't worry. Take time. Let's go and get some water for you. She got up and she got herself a glass of water to drink. And do you know what? She came back and she found she was sitting on her ticket. So how many of us, every day, every moment in our lives, so often sit on our ticket because we're not able to get perspective on life. So when she talked about humility in knowledge, humility and knowledge are integral because it's not just about the mind, it's about the total being. And like Tennyson, she would have believed, let knowledge go from more to more, but more of reverence in us dwell, that mind and soul according well may make one music as before. The two together make a particular kind of music. Now here, I think the last panel alluded to this. It's very important for us in the process of educating both men and women to have those moments of silence where we can actually hear ourselves think away from the clangor of the world. The beautiful temple here where people come, sit and connect with themselves and something else quietly in silence. Because the clangor of the world impinges on us in so many ways. And you know that the best music is created in the silence between notes. That's where the best music is really created. So can we build that into because there's too much of articulation about this process of learning. It's always about pouring out ideas, information. How do we sift it? How do we use the sense of discrimination of the Hamsa, the great swan, it could be Sri Ramakrishna, to distill that and integrate it? This is a big question. Now, when she talked about interconnection, she said, for example, that the interest of the coolie in Madras are knit up with the laborer in Punjab. And Blake has said this very beautifully. You pluck a flower and you disturb a star. You don't know that. So what is that sensibility? The sensibility is to be able to see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. It's that kind of sensibility that she was really talking about. And every choice that you make, whether you know it or not, because of the hidden connectors, every choice that we make has the power to impact many worlds. I think the last speakers told you that. You may not see this, so your choice, what you decide to say, who we decide to have a good evening out with, who we decide to enjoy music with, it has the power to impact worlds that we don't even know in whichever ways. Some people call it interconnectedness, some people call it karmic impacts, whatever you want, whatever kind of, shall I say, label you want to attach to it, that's entirely yours. The other thing is about learning for women is to also understand, I believe, the Tao of leadership. And there is a paradox, the Tao is what the Chinese and the Eastern philosophies talk about, the principles like adharma that control the working of the universe and the everyday life. And what is it? There's a paradox in this form of leadership. It's not just about, as I said, conventional notions of success, because one of the ways that Sister Nivedita spoke was to overturn, to flip our understandings of the limited notions of success. And here I'll come back to you about a little story before I finish this. And so the Tao has a paradox in it. And what is the paradox? The Tao of leadership. What is soft is strong. This is something that Sister learned from Sharadama. What is soft is strong. The serenity of surrender. That is, when you do something for someone, it gives you immense power. And there are different kinds of power. The power to push down and the power to pull up. Educating women is about the power to pull up. To ensure that you walk with people. Not that you're 5 steps ahead of somebody else. So, water. So they say consider water. Water is flexible. It's flowing. It has the Tao. It can wear down the worst of rock, the hardest of rock. Through its gentle flow, it can wear it down. It can wear down resistance. And therefore, this is the paradox. For us to be able to learn it and to live it, and in a sense to embody it, I think that's what Gandhiji, in some senses, and Sister Nivedita meant when they talked about the feminine principle. And we all have both the masculine and the feminine principle in us, the yin and the yang. So talking about this thing about success, there was this group of people who were getting together as alumna. It could have been in a big high-rise apartment in Gurgaon, where they were all getting together as a batch of whichever particular class of alumnus, and they'd all done very well in life. They'd all become CEOs, and they had become vice presidents of companies and so on. So the host was talking about, how much do you make? And there was this young girl, not very tall, Sangeeta, who was also part of that group. She was probably the only woman in that class of management trainees, I assume. So she said, oh, but come on, Sangeeta, what do you make? What can a teacher make? I mean, why would anybody go into teaching as a profession today? It doesn't even give you the basics that you want to live a good life. So she pondered a bit, and they were all sharing about their Mercedes-Benzes and their Volvos and everything. So she pondered a bit and she said, you know what I make? I make young people wonder. I make them say sorry and mean it. I make them understand the cultures of different lands. I make them want to help people. I make a C grader seem like a congressional medal holder. I make people feel good. And she stood up, all her height, and she said, Mr. CEO, I make a difference. What do you make? Okay. So the importance of moving out of our comfort zones of personal gratification to throw ourselves into the tumult of life and to make our voice count, to stand up for injustice where we can. This, I think, was what Sister Nivedita meant when she talked about the education of women. Because it's not enough to comfort the afflicted. There are many of us who are doing reasonable work among the poor and the needy. But it's equally important to afflict the comfortable, especially when they are wrong, when they are comfortably wrong. And I think that also requires that you begin to have a sensibility that is as open to the beauty, to the pain on our planet, as it is to the beauty of a bud unfolding. You have to have both. It can't be a binary. You have to be able to integrate that in the way in which you see the world and your role in it. So she would have been very thrilled with the women of the freedom movement in India. She would have also been very thrilled post that with the people who engaged with the freedom struggle, the nationalist movement. She would have equally been thrilled by an Aruna Roy who stood up to write the Right to Information Act in India. She would have been so proud of the women of the Chipko movement who saved trees. She would have been so proud of the women of the Bhopal gas Pirit Andolan who stood up and said that no, we are not going to take this just because a multinational wants to produce a particular kind of lethal gas in our country. She would also have been proud of all those who stood up against what happened to Nirbhaya. So each of you, and this is the great thing about the youth of today, men, young men and women are standing up for women's rights. This happened for the first time where both men and women marched the streets of Rajpath to make an appeal that, look, it cannot be business as usual. So I just thought I would also say that the idea of what she actually meant, I think, was this notion of simple abundance. Moving away from limits to possibilities. It's much more exciting. It's very simple to count the seeds in an apple. But it's much more exciting to try and envision how many apples there could be in a seed. Because it's limitless, as the speakers in the last session told you. It's limitless. When Roger Bannister ran the 4-minute mile, it was considered to be an impossible task for a person to do. Impossible. You could not do it. But within 6 months of him breaking that record, 6 other people did the same. Because what happened when one person steps out beyond limits and engages with possibilities, she or he sparks that possibility in many others. So once you break that mental limit, the body follows, the mind, and the rest of you, the spirit follows. I think I'm out of my time, but I'll just want to share with you a couple of things. I like to tell stories. I'm sorry I wasn't able to tell them all, but I do want to say that if you're looking at education, we always talk about it, sa vidya ya vimuktaye. That alone is knowledge that leads to liberation. Liberation of the self from prejudice. Liberation of society from injustice. Liberation of the world from violence. So to that process, the women of India, I think, can make a marvelous contribution, and they have to walk with the men. They have to include the men. Very often it's always seen that men are empowering the women, and I'm glad our speakers in the last session said that. Very often men also need to be empowered, because every time we are told, हमारी मर्दानगी पे ठेस पहुंच रहा है, अच्छे लड़के रोते नहीं हैं. Why not? The great sage Ramakrishna shed tears when he felt the pain of others. You have to be able to be soft in order to be strong. You have to be able to be vulnerable and transparent like the mirror. So one last story before I think I've overstepped my time. Anu was a 9-year-old girl from a small village. She finished attending elementary school till 4th grade at her village, and then she came to the city where she got admission into a fabulous school like perhaps Delhi. And when she got on the bus, she was full of excitement, full of what's going to happen? A new world is going to open up for her. And she went into class, very energetic. And because she was dressed in a particular way, we all talk about labels, Armani, this, that, the other, and we are so caught in these labels, which, by the way, I want to tell you, never fall for fashion, but always be in style. You have to have your own style. Fashion fades and style endures. And that, the simplicity of that fashion speaks its own language. The austerity, you've seen it among the monks and the nuns of the Ramakrishna order. So she reached the school, and then finally the teacher asked this class, of course everybody was a little askance about her. Here was this girl from the village, and what does she know, and so on. So the teacher asked the class that, okay, yesterday's lesson, what are the 7 wonders of the world? So I'm sure all of you know the 7 wonders of the world. I'm sure you know some of them. The Taj Mahal, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, Hanging Gardens of yeah, exactly. The Great Wall of China and so on. So the teacher was happy and the students remembered the 7 wonders. But this Anu was taking a very long time to write it out. She just couldn't figure out. So she said, teacher, there are so many, I don't know which to write. So she said, doesn't matter, Anu, don't worry. You just write any 7 that you think. Thinking that she would need help, she's not going to know this. She's come from a small rural school. And at the end of it, so the teacher picked up everybody else's, and most of the kids in the class had got the 7 wonders right, according to the previous day's lesson. And she read Anu's. She said the 7 wonders are to be able to see, to be able to hear, to be able to feel, to love, to think, to be kind, and to love. You know what that did to the class. तो मैं सिर्फ हमारी जो नारियां यहाँ हैं उनके लिए 2 पंक्ति पढ़ लूंगी. इनका नाम है नंगे पैर. कभी जो रहती थी 4 दीवारी में, कभी जो सिसकती थी बंद दरवाजों में, कभी जो घुटती थी पर्दे के पीछे, कभी जो मसली जाती थी पैरों के नीचे, कल तक जो थी एक झरोखे की मोहताज, वही औरत आज तोड़कर दरवाजे की अरगला निकल आई है बाहर, खड़ी है खुले आसमां के तले आजाद. ऑल द बेस्ट.